Much like any MMO you'll find today, Final Fantasy XIV contains a wide variety of group content to unlock during your time in Eorzea. However, I have noticed that things are done differently around here than in other games that I've played in the past. Hello there, I'm Kurojaku, and I'm here to tell you all you need to know about group content. This is the Sprout's Guide to Final Fantasy XIV. The first piece of group content you are likely to run into during your MSQ are dungeons, starting with Sastasha at around level 16. This is exactly what you'd expect in any other MMO. A themed instance with corridors of mobs leading up to a handful of boss rooms, and many of these tie directly into the main story while also having their own mini narratives going on during the dungeon itself. Though you may find optional dungeons from time to time that the MSQ won't lead you directly to, and you'll have to seek out on your own. Dungeons are done with what is called a light party, or a group of 4 players. Usually 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS, with loot being shared amongst everyone, though I'll explain more on how that works later. All in all, these are pretty cozy and fun, not too difficult and nothing really to be scared of regardless of what role you're playing, and a very good place to kind of learn what to do. I think the only dungeon that I can recall that had any sort of tricky mechanics involved was at the very end of Heavensward, at least so far. I haven't even played past Stormblood at this point. But for the most part, dungeons are pretty easy. Now, most group content in 14 usually has some sort of a harder variant. Usually you can recognize these by the suffix following the content name. But dungeons are the weird exception to this rule. While technically there are dungeons labeled as hard, air quotes, these are more like level cap altered remakes of earlier dungeons you've already played, and tend to have a follow-up on the dungeon story itself to go along with it. For a good example, Hawk Manor. I think it's pronounced Hawk Manor. Anyways, Hawk Manor is a level 28 MSQ dungeon. Meanwhile, Hawk Manor Hard is a level 50 follow-up with a slightly different layout and set of bosses, level 50 being the level cap of A Realm Reborn at the time the dungeon was added to the game. Now, around level 20-ish, you'll meet your first trial. Many of these will be directly tied into the main story, and unlike dungeons, don't have any loot and instead serve as narrative set pieces for the main storyline. The harder difficulties, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Trials are full party, or 8-player content, with double each role. 2 tanks, 2 supports, and 4 DPS, and are much more streamlined than dungeons. No corridors to walk through, just 1 room and a climactic boss fight with a pretty chunky health bar. Like I said before, when you first meet a new trial, it won't be too hard, mostly there for the plot. However, if you've cleared a trial and reached the post-game of that expansion, you can unlock the true hard mode variant called an Extreme. These do have loot, usually a weapon set themed after the boss, but only for classes that were available at the time it came out, orchestrion rolls, and even a rare mount unique to each trial. And if you collect all the unique trial mounts, you can put them all together and get a special shiny one off of the same theme. Extremes are a significant step up in difficulty, however. You will need to bring your A-game. It's not the hardest content by any means, but it does take some effort. Thankfully, if you're lazy and just want the shiny horse, you can run old Extremes unsynced and still get the drops. I will go more into how that works later and the difference between synced and unsynced, but for now, just know the older the Extreme is, the easier it is for you to get the special mounts from it. Next up are raids. Now, you won't be seeing any of these until you've finished A Realm Reborn and reached the post-game content before Heavensward. And even then, you won't be able to queue for a raid until you've finished Heavensward and gotten to its post-game content. It seems it took Square Enix a few years to work out the kinks and find a raid method they like, so the Realm Reborn raid is unfortunately a strange outlier, and you will likely have to find a friend to take you in unsynced if you want to see it for yourself. Quick editor's note here. Turns out the reason Coils is so excluded is because it was designed as a Savage level piece of content and not normal level like the other raids are going to be later, thus being way too hard to throw into a random party queue. So that's why it's weird. It'd be nice if they gave it an easier mode, but they're not going to do that. Take too much time. Anyways, moving on. With that out of the way, let's talk raids. These are also 8-player content, just like the trials, split up across 3 sets of 4 different instances for a grand total of 12 unique instances per raid, with many story moments and cutscenes in between on your first time through. These tend to play very similar to Trials, with a single room and a long boss fight, though some of the Heavensward raids do have a corridor or two leading up to the boss itself. Unlike Trials, however, even the normal raids are considered endgame content for their expansion, and require you to be at level cap. So level 60 for Heavensward, the first set of raids you can queue for, 70 for Stormblood, etc, etc. But on the bright side, you get loot, even on normal mode. Usually a whole bunch of bits and bobs that'll annoyingly flood your inventory until you throw them out or hand them in at Rowena's NPC friend somewhere in whatever hub you're playing. Blech. Each wing of the raid has its own set of weapons, and as well as glam for you to collect, but you may not care for these too much. That brings me on to Savage Raids, which is the hard mode. A much harder variant that rewards its own tokens, usually books from what I've seen so far. And more importantly, these can be turned in for dyeable versions of the same raid glam you could have gotten on normal, along with the other usual goodies like music and mounts and minions and etc, etc. Savage Raids are much more challenging and require a lot of practice and coordination running them synced. I haven't gotten to try one myself, since you will rarely find a group running synced Savage of older content. Most people just do it unsynced, get their gear, their glam, and move on. So I have not gone to the current X-Pack yet, and I can't find a group to play the old ones, but I have been told Savage is no joke, and some of the hardest group content you will find. Not the hardest, that's something else entirely, but still going to make you sweat a little bit. Also unlocked in the post-game are Alliance Raids. Split up across 3 separate instances, for a full raid, you will enter with a party of 8 players. And 2 other full parties. That's right, there are 24 people in this raid at the same time. These play more like a dungeon than a raid or trial, actually, at least the ones I've seen so far, and are honestly pretty easy. Others editors note, they were easy until Stormblood, then things got a little spicy. You had to do math at one point. Anyways, moving on. That being said, there is a lot of loot to be had here, and maybe some unique glamour to get your hands on as well if you're interested. Everything drops from in the raid itself, so no weird token items to hand in like the 8-man raids. As for hard mode, well, so in the most recent mainline patch of the game, at the time of me writing all this, they added the first ever chaotic Alliance raid, which would be the hard mode. This plays more like a 24-player trial, as it doesn't have corridors or anything, it is just one room with a boss. And I've heard mixed opinions about the chaotic raid so far. The difficulty is closer to an extreme trial, but you can imagine the frustration when there's 23 other chances for human error in a very long fight. I look forward to trying it myself, but again, I've heard some people are not fond. That being said, unlike most hard modes, Chaotic is not at the level cap of its matching Alliance raid, and it is instead at the level cap of the current expansion. Which reminds me of one more piece of content that functions quite similarly. Ultimate.
Such devastation! This was not my intention!
Don't let the name Uwu fool you. And yes, that is actually the name of one of them. This is the pinnacle of endgame content in Final Fantasy. Absurdly difficult ultra raids themed around a previous raid series or MSQ finale that I'm honestly very much looking forward to suffering through, eventually. With multiple phases in a row, each with its own boss, or bosses, sometimes, and mechanics to memorize, and no breaks in between. Much like the Chaotic raid, these are set to the level cap at the time of that ultimate, when it was released. With the earliest ones being level 70, and more importantly, you cannot unsync. There is no choice but to run it at a synced level. There is no overleveling allowed, no easy ways out. Now, since I've mentioned synced and unsynced like 12 times without explaining myself, I guess now's a good time. Essentially, when you queue for content, you will be doing it synced, meaning your level, gear, skills available to you will all be brought down to match the content you are doing, basically giving you the true, real experience of that dungeon or whatever it may be. Unsynced, however, which you can toggle on up here if you wish, allows you to go in with your current gear, skills, and level, as well as giving you this echo boost that drastically buffs your stats. This is why a current level cap player can easily go back and one-shot extreme trial bosses in A Realm Reborn to get the mounts they missed, as a good example, and also how people tend to farm old Savage Raid glamour and rare drops. On the topic of loot, allow me to explain how the loot system tends to work in 14. When you open a chest in a dungeon, or trial, or raid, you will get a pop-up somewhere on your screen depending on where you've placed it. In that menu, you can choose to either need, greed, or pass on any items in the loot pool. Need is for anything that's a collectible, or non-class specific, as well as gear for the class you are on. Greed is for gear you cannot use, and pass just rolls a 0 and opts out and says I don't want this in my inventory. If you click need or greed, you'll see a number appear on the item. Whoever happens to get the highest number will get the item in their bag, everyone else gets nothing. When it comes to alliance raids, you will see 3 chests per encounter, labeled after each party. You can also see which alliance you are in if you look at your party list. Only the loot in your party's list will be seen, and only you and those 7 other people are rolling against each other for the drop, not all 24. In addition to this, there are also sometimes items that are a boss drop, meaning it has a chance to just pop up in your bag when a boss dies, or an exit drop, where an item just gets snuck into your pockets on the way out of the instance, whether you like it there or not. Now, there are certainly other group content. Deep Dungeons, Eureka, the Quicksands on Balmung, etc, etc. But what I've shown you today are just the basics you'll find in your duty finder, and hopefully I've managed to clear things up well enough. But for now, that will be all. Until next time.